Welcome back to the Business of Biotech. I'm Matt Pillar. And since talking with today's guest a couple of weeks ago, I've been so looking forward to getting back together with her to record this episode. She's a brilliant biotech risk taker, and I don't use that combination of words lightly. I describe her that way because her scientific, academic, and postdoc work, married with well over a decade of investment banking work, serve as the foundation of that brilliance, which she's now leaning into when weighing risk as a biotech builder. Her name is Dr. Zandy Forbes. She's the president and CEO at Meira GTX. And on today's episode, we'll get to know her and we'll learn about some of the bold, fundamental decisions she's led Meira through on the company's way to building a very deep pipeline of gene therapy candidates across the clinical spectrum, and doing the development and manufacturing of those candidates, I might add, in-house. Dr. Forbes, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. And what a lovely introduction. Thank you.
I appreciate it. And I mean every word of it. You know, it strikes me when I was thinking about that conversation that we had a couple of weeks ago. I kind of went long on the setup, like, this is what the Business of Biotech's all about. This is what we're after. I think I asked you one question and your passion, enthusiasm, and intelligence just took over. I mean, I was super excited. I after doing those pre-briefs, I know like this is going to be a great episode, or not to set the bar too high for you, but but I've been excited about this one. By the way, Meira GTX, do you go by Meira GTX or is it Meira Gene Therapeutics?
GTX is fine.
All right.
Whatever people are willing to say is fine.
Very cool. So as I mentioned, you've got from the outset, right? If you look at your CV, your academic record, if you will, you have the makings of what looks like an academic career. You have an Oxford PhD in molecular genetics. You did postdoc fellowships at the Skirball Institute of Biomolecular Medicine at NYU Langone. You did fellowships at Duke University and the Carnegie Institute at Johns Hopkins after your PhD. It looks like this woman is setting herself up for a career in research and academia. And then in 2000, not long after that, you became a healthcare investor at the hedge fund Civic Global Healthcare.
Yes.
So two questions wrapped up here. One, when you were doing your PhD and doing that fellowship work, your postdoc stuff, at that time, in that moment, were you thinking academia, research? So that's part one of the question. And then part two of the question is, at what point were you exposed to and did you embrace investment banking?
So my academic career really began as an undergraduate at Cambridge. And at the time, I was courted as a person who had very good grades in my part ones. I was courted by the newly deregulated City of London. And I used to receive letters, because we didn't have emails then. Dear Mr. Forbes, please, will you consider coming for an interview as a salesperson? I went for one interview where I imagined myself, it was for a commodities trader, okay? And I knew nothing about Wall Street, trading, anything. So in my mind's eye, I saw myself, my future, as the woman from Del Monte who travels the world and sources and provides the world's commodities, right? I got to the interview and they asked me about sales and trading. I didn't know what any of these things were, and I failed. I had another interview in response to the Dear Mr. Forbes letters. And so when I finished at Cambridge, I got a very high grade degree. I didn't really know what to do, because that seemed to be where people went or where people were courted to, right? Mm-hmm. The big city for Goldman and those sort of places. And I took a year off and ended up finding a topic that was super fascinating and super unknown, which is how does one cell develop into an embryo where every gene is only used in the right cells? What is positional information? How does life go from one cell to organisms? And I found someone who was at Oxford to do a PhD in this subject in fruit flies, where a screen had just been done that identified every gene that was required from an egg to make a fruit fly. And so that to me was a huge, it was a universe of interesting undiscovered things. And I went and I did my PhD. And when I finished the PhD, I happened to have worked on a gene that was one of these positional information molecules. And I was invited, I didn't know what exactly to do. I was invited to do visiting professorships at Hopkins and Duke. So I didn't have a plan. I never had a plan, and that is a failing in my life. I feel I would have been much more successful as a particular thing had I had a plan and pursued single-mindedly that plan. And I admire people who do that and encourage people to do that. But given I didn't have a plan, I was falling into these academic roles based on what I'd just done. And interestingly, I fell into the position at NYU because I gave a talk at MIT, and the woman who I met with offered me a job in her lab. This woman is one of the brightest, most inspiring scientists I know. She's called Ruth Lehman, and she was actually the individual that did that screen, that found those genes. And she was moving to NYU, where she was able to really broaden her lab, broaden what she did. And I was there because of her and because of her work. And towards the end of that tenure, when I was setting up a lab in the UK, I, by chance, met the person, Christian Sood, who at that time, the year 2000, was the best performing hedge fund in the world. I didn't intend to meet him. Someone I'd been at Cambridge with was an investor, and his bank had money with Christian. So I met him. And at the first interview, he gave me the reds for some recent IPOs: Abgenix, Medirex, Exelixis. And I was a fruit fly geneticist, and I looked at them, and suddenly, explosion. I suddenly saw that outside academia, in biotech, people were doing everything. They were trying to discover everything, not just one gene in one fly in one lab. And that and a number of things, I literally went back and met Christian, put out my hand and said, yeah, I accept your job. No contract, no negotiation, nothing. I went back to Ruth and I said, I'm going to do this. And they all said, you can't do it. You're so good at this. But it wasn't that I was so good at doing research. They told me that of the postdocs and visiting professors they'd had, what I was good at was teaching. So I took a year off and spent it in this hedge funds, and I never went back. But I did, if I may spend one more minute.
Of course.
When I took the job at this fund, which was at the time a fund called Galleon, it was very secretive, as long short funds are, and particularly where at that time still are. And I used to go back to my lab to sort virgin fruit flies, because you have to get them before they've mated so you know what progeny they're going to have. And I felt this sort of claustrophobic feeling at work. It was the first actual job I'd had. And I would go back and I'd sort my fruit flies. and I'd feel I could breathe and I could feel that my mind was flying because I could think, I could daydream about anything. And I did at that time realize what an incredible luxury and what an incredible opportunity to think anything you want being an academic is. So, would I have kept going as an academic? Yes. Was it my plan? No. I rather abruptly took an opportunity that I knew nothing about, which was incredibly hard for me when I then ended up doing it, both emotionally, like this being confined for the first time, you're paid for how you're going to use your mind. But in that job, I learned more than I'd learned in 10 years of academia, in every day of school and university about medicine, science, people, businesses, incentives, and failure.
Yeah.
Because if you're an investor, you really, really feel the failure of everything you invest in because you are responsible for making that money. And it's not money that it's about being wrong. So I'm wrong on an FDA panel. I've watched so many FDA panels. You're wrong on an FDA panel. You're wrong on an FDA decision. You're wrong on a drug development trial. You're wrong on a product. You're wrong on a launch. You feel it and you remember it. I remember Genentech's panel for Avastin in breast cancer, like a video, right? Because I was watching the faces of each person and the patient advocates and how the FDA had put together that panel. And I was wrong.
Yeah.
So it was an incredible learning experience. And what you also learn is when you're in a position where the money is, like a really big hedge fund, everyone wants to talk to you.
Yeah.
When you are not, no one wants to talk to you. So that contrast of how you deal with people and you deal with your own position as it's not your position of being desired versus being not desired. It's also a real learning experience in life in general, but that's applied to how you run businesses and manage people and do deals.
Yeah. Yeah. You mentioned, I mean, you talked about the emotional aspects of that learning and making that transition. Just let me put it this way. What else was in the very early days? What else was difficult for you to learn and grasp? And I ask that question because you're obviously an accomplished academic with a very expandable and malleable learning capacity. You think you could do anything. What was challenging for you to embrace and absorb? And what had to change? Like, what did you have to adapt about yourself?
So I think that so first there's the first year, right?
Mm-hmm.
The first year, I didn't know what the word short meant. I didn't know I'd never seen a P&L. I went to 1 week after my first year at Columbia Business School, right? So it was language. I had the language of science, which was very rapidly translated into the language of medicine. So I found that very intuitive. The language of business and of Wall Street, right? I'd never heard the words, I'd like to give you a heads up, just for example. So how salespeople talk to you. I mean, as trivial as that. I kept thinking when they came, oh yeah, I just wanted to give you a heads up, Zandy. And I kept thinking of meerkats. I'd never heard these words because I lived in a different world. It was as trivial as that.
Yeah.
It was jargon. It was all of those things. I will say the claustrophobia aspect related to having sold my brain to focus on things that I didn't understand. Now, the first way I started understanding companies, I wasn't taught, was listening to earnings calls, right? And that taught me. And in fact, reading 10Qs and 10Ks, and I couldn't believe it. I mean, they're just almost incomprehensible and totally repetitive when you actually read them back to back. And just kind of getting a feel of a structure of how things are, as well as learning slightly what at least lawyers think about when they are putting together and running companies. But Christian said to me, and he was right, he said, look, Zandy, you know nothing. And in about a year, you'll start feeling you're going to be able to give opinions on stocks. In about 3 years, I will listen to everything you say. And what actually happened is in that time frame, I took over actually being a portfolio manager of the small biotech fund. And when you ask me about transitions in what you learn and how you do things, that was the most transformative transition. Because when you're an analyst or a stock picker, the general thesis is, as a scientist, you are going to be able to have an edge by understanding the science, by looking at data and assessing the risk. And there is some vague truth to that. However, when I took over that small biotech fund, I looked at the performance of the fund the year before, when the market had been up a little bit, and they were down. But when you look at why, they were down only because 2 or 3 of those positions had gone to zero, because one thing had failed. Everything else was okay. So it was at that moment I realized that in this industry, if you avoid disaster, if you avoid losing money, you will definitely make money. And that really informed how I was in constructing a portfolio. I also recognize that however good you are at science, or however great a physician you are, or however brilliant you think you are, you will never really understand the risk of a clinical trial or an FDA outcome. You can guess it's more positive than negative. So in constructing a portfolio, we tended to take positions where we would look at not what was definitely going to happen, it was going to be positive or negative, but if it was positive for this stock, not this company, for this stock, where would the stock price go? And every company has its own hindrances or supports for valuation. Where would the stock price go? If it's negative, where would the stock price go? So are you willing to take a bet and lose that percent? And that decision depends on your performance. It depends on a lot of things. But you can do things, particularly in biotech, which are very constantly done in other markets of, selling puts, selling calls, not naked, but paying for hedges to allow you to take bets which you have a biased view on. So I learned sort of how to address my own feeling of risk, because that's all it really is for human beings. We're really, really bad at assessing risk, right? And formalizing it by deciding how much I was willing to lose. And that is very like my nature.
Hmm.
And as a portfolio manager, I'm sure every one of these incredibly successful fund managers, their personality is expressed in their portfolios like a sculptor expresses themselves in the outline of their sculpture.
Yeah.
And that way of managing a portfolio did mean that the performance that we had was really good because we didn't lose big amounts of money. We didn't go for binary events to make 10 times the money. We incrementally made money. And also, if you are intuitively curious and a bit of a Sherlock Holmes in how you think about things, interestingly, understanding who's going to buy whom and strategically what's best in an industry, a lot of the big bets that we made were on takeouts, and a lot of them were right because it's things that are obvious. Not everything that is obviously good always happens, but having a slightly more strategic view of how people and companies fit together, also gained over time, was very helpful and
Yeah.
helpful now as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And I feel like I could spend the next hour asking you questions about that period of your life, but I want to get to what's helpful now. So we're gonna move forward a little bit. You spent 12 years, I think, in the
Yeah,
investment
about a
banking world.
decade. Yeah, more or less.
Yeah.
I consider academia a decade, hedge fund a decade, this a decade, but there's wiggle room on both sides. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so the current decade,
yeah.
when you transition to Cadman Holdings, which has since been acquired by Sanofi, you went there as SVP of Commercial Operations from investment banking. What was the story there? Like it sounds like you you got to a point where you embraced the role, were comfortable with wrong. See, this is one of the things that when I said we could talk for much longer about your time in investment banking, one of the things I wanted to ask you, which you can reflect on before you get to the Cadman Holding story, is the difference between wrong as a research scientist, academician, in science, the difference between being wrong there and being wrong as you as people frequently are in investment banking. Yeah, I want to stick with that question.
Yeah. Do you want me to answer that question?
I do. I do. Yeah. I promised that we'd move on to Cadman Holding, but I need to know.
Okay. I will answer it super simply. You're never wrong in science, ever, because you're finding out something that's true or not. So if what you thought is wrong, it means something else is true,
Yeah.
right?
Okay.
So you're not wrong in science.
Yeah.
And I do think that sometimes in science, you know, where things do go wrong is when people think they're right. And if what they show is not supportive of what they think, they consider it wrong.
Hmm.
But as a matter of science, right? Science is fact based. And if you're proved wrong, that's part of the scientific process.
Yeah.
Whatever science it is, whether it's cell biology or genetics is. However, the complete antithesis is true in public markets trading. There is only one measure of being wrong or right because you're using that market to make your clients money.
Yeah.
And so, however right you are from a scientific perspective, if the position you've chosen to take ends up being completely wrong, you are wrong. You
Yeah.
made a mistake. Now, was it your fault? None of it matters. And that's one of the reasons, from my perspective, that I found it a place of learning because you are obviously wrong. The stock's up or down. You're long or
Yeah.
short. You're wrong or right. And it's not you're wrong like a VC in 5 years. You're wrong that minute and you deal with it. I, I will never forget that. there were lots of things I was right about as a scientist.
Hmm.
I could not have been more wrong in that moment. So, very different, I suppose, what is wrong, what is right, but very different measures of wrongness and rightness, where
How do
the
you
same skills are somehow involved.
yeah, yeah. How do you reconcile that? How did you rationalize being wrong when it was being wrong in investment banking was so different from being wrong in science? And then I promise we'll move on to
Well, it's the recognition that how I rationalized it was this recognition that I could know about science. I could know about a clinical trial. I could know about a mechanism. And in fact, I could be the world expert. And I could also have spoken to world experts and 20 of them, because no point in speaking to one world expert, because you're definitely going to get something wrong from them. But it doesn't matter because biology is, we know so little about it, really, that it's unpredictable. And I learned that however right you might think you are, that when you're making decisions about things like clinical outcomes or, an FDA decision, there are so many things you don't know about that could make you wrong, that rather than betting on your own rightness, which is actually what you're told to do, and I think it drives some of the bad behavior in public market biotech investing sometimes, you really don't have an edge and you don't know things before other people. So all you can do is have a very, very good understanding of what would happen if you're right, what would happen if you're wrong, and choose to mitigate both of those. You will accept less on the upside
Mhm.
or accepting less on the downside. So, not going for the massive bets, but making sure that whatever you decide, you will always make money.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think it's really, when you're wrong over and over again, as one is, you learn that, you may think you're a genius, but you've got to think that you could easily be wrong. And that's
Did you
huge education for
yeah.
everything you later do.
Did you carry that mentality into the move in the industry when you joined Cadman Holdings, or did you kind of put those pieces together once you were in the industry?
I think that the way of, first of all, with respect to different people having different personalities, I'm a person who looks out into the world. I've got quite a lot of adventure in me, but also quite a lot of fear. So, how do those two things marry? I would say that one of the things I do to make myself calm and be adventurous is I go, what's worst case scenario? So, it's checking out worst case scenario and mitigating that, and then going up allows me to build things that are risky because there are so many layers of alternative, which
Yeah,
is really, really embedded in the company that we've built at Meira.
yeah.
And it's not necessarily the easiest to convey to investors or to convey to what might be an ultimate buyer, which is pharma, because they're more used to almost like a binary stock pick, like clinical trial that's going to be a phase 3, that's going to be a single product. Are you going to commercialize it? Are you going to sell to pharma? What event do you have in the next 12 months? I find that from an emotional point of view very difficult to handle that binary risk.
Mhm.
So I am very it's not even controllable. It is wherever I see a potential risk, I put a layer to mitigate it. in place where I can, which includes a broad pipeline of things that are de-risked. It then manufacturing, that de-risks everything. Optimization, not just of capsids, not just of promoters, but of everything. So it's a very broad view of optimization, which is the opposite side of the coin of risk mitigation, right? And that allowed us to have a company that's highly resilient to a failure or the markets or changes in what's the favorite product, whether it's Alzheimer's or GLP-1. And at the same time, be able to build a company that actually invents technology, like controlling biologics with pills, right? So it's this sort of multi-layered cushions that you can see value in all these layers, and they're each supporting one another. So it very much fed through to how we built the company. And the company wasn't obviously just me, but who joined the company when we formed from the fund that I worked with, again, is Rich Giroux, who's our COO and CFO. He was head trader for a decade with me. And so he executed my ideas in the world. And I trust him more than anyone, really. I've worked with him since 2021. And he hears the words I say and he understands them. And same from him. So this sort of fund management perspective, which isn't really fund management, it's a sort of multi-strat risk approach, was not just me, it's the founders of the company and how we built the company.